So, thanks, Jasmine. My name is Bill Lindeke, and I've spent the last 10 years studying sidewalks. I know what you're probably thinking. Sidewalks? Really? How complicated can that be? And that's a great question, because really, that's true. Sidewalks are 5 feet of concrete, maybe 10 feet if you're lucky, that stretch between the street and the curb, the street and the yard, and the building and the curb. And that's it. Sidewalks are pretty straightforward things. I started getting interested in sidewalks, though, when, probably like a lot of people, I moved to a few different cities. I went off to college, lived in New York for a little while, a couple places, and I noticed how much I was walking and how different sidewalks could look. I'm going to begin today's talk and end today's talk with a pair of cliches, so that's fair warning. But the first cliche is, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So I think everyone's heard that before. And what it means to me is the way that cities can change and sort of sculpt our habits and our tastes, right? It's that feeling when you go to a new place and you start walking around, and you find after the first day or maybe the second day that your feet are really sore. That reflects the way that sidewalks shape our lives. Some sidewalks are wonderful. They invite you along and they help you walk much farther than you ever thought you wanted to, right? And other sidewalks, just going for a simple walk down the block feels like a marathon. They're not inviting. It seems almost impossible to walk down the street. So it was that difference, the way that sidewalks can be so different from each other, that made me really interested in this topic. And so 10 years ago, actually it was even more than that, I started a blog about sidewalks here in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis and in St. Paul. And I took a lot of pictures of sidewalks and told stories about them and how they made me feel, how I liked walking in some places and I didn't like walking in other places. And I got really interested in this topic. I even went to graduate school for it, so there's just next door. The geography department is actually around the block here, and I studied there for 7 years, learning about sidewalks, about street design, and something called non-motorized transportation, so people who walk or bike around, and what kind of streets make them feel welcome or comfortable, and what kind of streets they don't like. So that's what I've been studying. And I've come to the conclusion that we get sidewalks wrong in America. We don't spend nearly enough time thinking about sidewalks and how important they are. So today I want to give you 3 different ways of looking at sidewalks, 3 things to think about the next time you're walking around the street. So the first thing is that sidewalks are a measure. They measure our health. They measure our individual health, so how much you or I walk around, but also our public health, how much we walk around together as a collective. The average American actually walks only about 5,000 steps a day, which is less than many places around the world. They also measure our global health. So lots of trips on an everyday basis for most people are short trips. They're trips that we could be walking, but often we don't do it. We don't walk, we drive, and it's because our sidewalks aren't good enough. They're not welcoming enough. They don't make it easy. So here's a story. This is something I did a couple years ago. It's called a Pedestrian Count. The problem is that our cities have really good information and data about how many cars are going by on the street. It's really easy to count those. You just put those little rubber strips, maybe you've seen these, down on the street, and you leave them there for a couple days. And after a little while, you've got great data, great information about exactly how many people drove by, how fast those cars were going, and what times of day they were going. It's really easy. But people is a different story. So people like to skip around, they like to wander, they like to cut through parking lots or driveways or down through the Burger King drive-through. That's what you see. And so it's really hard to count people, and as a result, most cities don't have much idea at all about how many people are walking around on their sidewalks. So what we do in Minneapolis and in St. Paul is once a year, they get a lot of volunteers to use elbow grease and go out to different corners around the city and actually sit there and count the people. So that's what I was doing, and this is the corner that I got assigned. It's right near my house. Yeah, it's in the west side of St. Paul, and it's where 2 main streets come together. It's not really a special corner. It is a main intersection, though. It's a place that has a lot of the old buildings, maybe a little run down these days. There's a Burger King. There's a little car repair place. There's some offices for a nonprofit. And then there's this liquor store also, I should say. And then there's this big vacant lot on the hill that sort of overlooks the whole intersection, and that's where I chose to plant myself. So I took my little notebook, and I sat down there, and I got ready to count the people. And it turned out that it actually was some of the most depressing 2 hours I've ever spent. Because there weren't any people. There weren't anybody walking around. So I sat there for 10 minutes, and an endless stream of cars went by down the street coming out of downtown. And then there would be one guy walking with a plastic bag, kind of trudging along, and then he'd disappear. And then I'd write one. The highlight of the day, though, was when a group of teenagers, sort of younger teenagers, came down the hill to my left beside me, tumbling down and talking and sort of laughing and having a good time. The whole 2 hours I spent there, they were the only people that actually saw me and noticed me and smiled and said something to me. And of course, what they said was, "Hey, what are you doing in that vacant lot?" So that's a fair question. And so I said, "I'm counting people." And I pointed out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were 8 of them. But that was the highlight. And as they pushed the little button on the traffic pole and disappeared around the corner, I just sat there and I got kind of depressed because there wasn't anybody walking around. I started to imagine if I had an airplane, right, and I could travel to any city around the world and go to a similar corner, I would probably find more people walking around than I did on St. Paul on that afternoon. And then because I still had another hour to go, I started daydreaming about if I had a time machine, right? And you could travel to any city that's ever existed in the entire history of the human race and sit down on a corner similar to the one I was at. I would see more people than I was walking around on that day in St. Paul. So that's a little depressing. Of all the sidewalks that have ever existed, this was one of the worst. And I began to think, well, why is that? Why aren't we walking anymore? If sidewalks are a measure of our health, of our individual and social health, this isn't a very good sign. So the second way of thinking about sidewalks is as freedom. So sidewalks are a basic reflection of our right to walk around and get around our neighborhoods. Picture if you're in a wheelchair. I saw some people who are in wheelchairs, so you can just be yourself. But the rest of us, picture if you're in a wheelchair, you have some sort of mobility issue. Maybe it's temporary or maybe it's permanent, and you depend on that sidewalk to get around. If there's a bump, if there's a big crack, if there's a pole in the way, if there's an angle that's not the right angle, then you have to either go out into the street, turn around, or get into the dirt. This is an everyday reality for people, our most vulnerable citizens who are trying to get around on sidewalks of our cities. And there's so many bad sidewalks that turn sidewalks that should be freedom into a kind of prison. So you get the classic pole in the way. In Minnesota, you get the ice on the sidewalk. Sometimes you get the combo, the pole in the way with the ice on the sidewalk. You get detours that we make, so we put our detours, or we don't provide pedestrian detours for people. You get a patio in the way with a detour sign. Sometimes people park on the sidewalk and leave people with no option. This happens all the time, every day for people trying to get around. And it's not even just people with disabilities. Just try crossing the street. So a sidewalk is only as good as the crosswalk that connects it. You can have a perfect sidewalk, but if you get to that intersection and it seems really dangerous, it seems like you're stepping off a cliff when you're trying to cross the street, well, then that sidewalk is pretty much useless. And that's how so many of our streets and sidewalks are. This is a corner in St. Paul where a woman named Kunlek Wangmo was killed earlier this year. She lived in the neighborhood, and every day she and her husband would walk down 7th Street and cross the street right here. And then one morning, a car turned around and went around the corner too fast and killed her. And I could tell 3 more stories like this because there have been 4 deaths so far this year in St. Paul. Shelby Kokesh, Elizabeth Durham, and Chani Keck was the most recent one. This is the crosswalk where she was killed, going out of her office, the healthcare clinic where she works, and trying to get to her car. For every one of these deaths, these tragedies, there are 50 times where people in St. Paul are hit by a car and end up with an injury of some kind. And I think, we don't have data, but I think that for every one of those injuries, there are dozens of near misses, times when you almost get hit and are terrified. And it's moments like these that keep people from walking, keep people from wanting to walk around the city. And this is in St. Paul, which, I should be fair, is one of the safer cities for sidewalks in the country. So if it's like this here, what do you think it's like in places like Florida or Texas that have our most dangerous streets? I think we could do better. So that was the bad news. The good news is that this is a solvable problem. The good news is that there are so many great sidewalks out there. I've been traveling around and looking at cities that have wonderful sidewalks, like this one in Boston or this one in San Francisco. Lovely wide sidewalk. And each one of these great sidewalks is a little bit different, is a little bit unique. I've come to see sidewalks as a mirror. So sidewalks reflect our public selves, how we treat each other at our most vulnerable. When you look at sidewalks and watch people and how they look at each other and talk to each other and interact with each other, you start to see how we can learn to understand some of the difference and diversity that make our cities, that make up our communities. The key ingredient, though, is to make sure that we get the safety part right. So there are a lot of little tricks that cities can do to make sidewalks safe places. This is temporary bump outs that you can install on street corners to make sure that people have visibility and cars slow down a little bit when they're turning corners. This one was installed in Minneapolis last year, and you could do this in many more places. This is a pedestrian median. So this was installed in St. Paul 2 years ago. It lets people cross the street without feeling like they're taking their lives into their hands. There are so many little tricks like this that we could do if we spent a little time and a little bit of money and paid attention to the details of sidewalks. And that's the hard part. Once you do that, then you can start making great sidewalks. You can start having a little more fun. So one great thing is street trees. In the springtime, they have little flowers on them. And then in the summer, they give you shade so that it's not so hot. You can have streets with shop windows, and windows are a wonderful addition to streets. They give you something to look at, so when you're walking around, you are engaged with your environment, something that draws you forward as you're walking through your downtowns. Something as simple as a porch or a stoop or steps. I call these porous boundaries between the private space of the home and the public space of the sidewalk. And by the way, they make great places to put pumpkins in the Halloween. So every great city, every great sidewalk should have sidewalk cafes, places for people watching, which, to be frank, is the #1 attraction of sidewalks in the first place. And then you want somewhere where people can rest. They can be accidental or they can be on purpose, but benches that allow sidewalks to treat folks with a little bit of dignity. Each great sidewalk is a little bit different. So there's no one secret ingredient, but there's lots of things that come together, kind of like cooking, like a good recipe. So they reflect the tastes and the culture of a specific place and time. And that's why it's really important to get involved in these decisions. A lot of people think about politics as being something that happens on the grand scale. So Trump versus Clinton, or who's elected president, right? Or who's elected to your Senate seat. But decisions about sidewalks are happening at the local scale. They're happening at the community center or the church or at your neighbor's house down the block. And it's easy to get involved in these conversations and start sharing your experiences of walking and what it's like. You can also start simply with your own yard and your sidewalk in front of your house. So this is one I saw the other day with pink flamingos in the yard. Maybe you fly a flag. Maybe you have a great garden. Or maybe you have one of these little free libraries. I think everybody has seen one of these. You put books in there, and then people, when they're walking by, can take them. The golden rule of sidewalks for me is something I like to call serendipity. So it's the idea, the question about when you're walking around in your streets and your sidewalks, how many times do you encounter somebody that you didn't expect to see? The other day, I was in downtown St. Paul. I was going to a minor league baseball game at the new stadium down there, and there was a couple events going on, and the sidewalks were full of people. And in the next 24 hours of walking around downtown and spending time there, I saw 10 different people that I didn't expect to see that day. It was a guy from college many years ago. It was someone I knew from Twitter. It was a really good friend of mine, or it was just a coworker that I recognized. Each one of these little moments doesn't mean a lot by itself. Sometimes you say hi, sometimes you smile, sometimes you have a long conversation. But when you add them all together, they become something really important. They become sort of the way that we connect to each other. They become our sense of community. I think that without great sidewalks, we're missing the foundation for that social fabric. We become isolated individuals. We become less than the sum of our parts. Sometimes I like to think back about the vacant lot and sitting there for 2 hours and about how many people would buy me that day. So how many hundreds or thousands of people passed through the corner while I was sitting there, shared the same space at the same time on the same day in St. Paul. But how many times did people even notice each other? How many glances were exchanged? How many people made eye contact? How many people smiled? Did anybody have a conversation that day? I think we can do better than this. I want us to start building better sidewalks, places that welcome walking, that let people stay active and healthy without having to go to the gym. I'd like us all to go walking around our homes or our schools or our offices and start looking and seeing the sidewalks around us. Ask yourself if anybody's walking, and if they're not, why not? And then ask yourself if the sidewalks are treating you with respect, they're making you feel safe and secure and comfortable. And don't just think about yourself, think about your grandparents or your children and how would they feel on that sidewalk. And then I would like people to think about what you can do to make a better sidewalk, maybe together or maybe individually, little things you can do to make it better. So here's the second cliche that I warned you about. It's the idea that every journey begins with a single step. I think there's a long way to go to make better sidewalks in our cities, but it's a lot easier than it sounds, and I would love for all of us to begin that journey together.